Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to our February meeting. A few words, as usual, from me, just by way of introduction. Firstly, by way of apology, I have a somewhat croaky voice from a cold which developed over the weekend. It's a good old-fashioned English cold. I've been nowhere near China, but if I sound a little bit strained, that's why. Mobile phones off, please, or at least to silent. If there is any form of emergency, which hopefully there will not be, if it's safe to do so, you can go out the way you came in, up the stairs and out into the piazza. If for any reason that is not appropriate, there are alternatives behind me. That's the safety notices out of the way. Looking ahead to the next two meetings. The first of those is on Thursday the 5th of March, which is John Carr, who's normally here as a meeting steward, though he's absent tonight, who is going back to his professional background in public transport administration and particularly public transport coordination, in a talk entitled South to North and Back Again, Journeys in Search of Transport Integration. So that's John on the afternoon of Thursday the 5th of March, for which you must book, please, because we're constrained at Acton by the size of the meeting room, but there are seats available at the moment. And then in a month's time, in fact it must be 5 weeks' time, Monday the 23rd of March, our next meeting here is Paul Sainthouse, who is Managing Director of Dawson's Rental. Paul has had a career, although he's worked for the Dawson's Group for some considerable time, has a career in public transport spanning over 35 years. As well as his day job with the Dawson Group, he's the current president of the Chartered Institute of Logistics in Transport in the UK. He's also a director of the Confederation of Passenger Transport, along with many other voluntary roles in the business. He's a patron of the London Transport Museum, which is excellent to hear, a freeman of the City of London and a member of the Worshipful Company of Carmen. But apart from all of that, he is also, his notes say, the enthusiastic owner of 2 restored London Transport Roostmaster buses. So a splendid chap for that reason, if for no other reason. And Paul is going to talk on his Routemaster passion in 5 weeks' time. Again, spaces are available. Book if you can, because it will reserve you a seat, and there may not be places available if you don't. We advertised in the recent issue of the magazine a number of forthcoming visits, which I will not describe in any detail. There are 5 of them. As we speak, all have places available, though I think I'm right in saying, John, the walk, the London Southwark Walk, is very close to capacity. 4 places available. So if you're interested particularly in the walk, you might grab John Cakeley and tell him later on tonight, because that's a limited number of 30, and we're getting close to that maximum. But all the other visits, there are places available. They all have enough bookings to guarantee that the events will run, but as long as you go through the booking process, either through Helen Cakeley, if it's one that John and Helen have organised, or through Mike Kay, if it's one of his more ambitious long-distance trips. As I say, places are available, but obviously you must book. And that's all I needed to say, I think. I've got words about Nick in front of me, but in fact, that really sums it up. I'll read a slightly edited version of what I've got, just to put a bit of meat on the bones. Nick is an experienced London-based newspaper journalist and broadcaster and author with a background in politics, transport, defence and Scottish affairs. He has written leaders for the Telegraph and the Sun, and over 500 obituaries for the Telegraph. So if he buttonhole you afterwards and says, just tell us a little bit about your life, beware, that's the Grim Reaper knocking on the door. But as well as freelancing in all the fields in which he's been active as a journalist, he undertakes a whole range of projects for consultancies, lectures in the fields in which his expertise lies, and is a 50-year member of the Omnibus Society, which is close to my heart in a slightly different audience. He writes for Today's Railways and is a working volunteer with the Bluebell Railway. So that's the background. The talk is on what it was that Nick first found interesting in public transport and what it was that generated a lifetime's interest in, it says public transport here, but it says London buses there, so we'll see whether it's just bus related. I think not, because I've seen one or two of the pictures. Nick, over to you. I will switch my mic off.
And I think I've just switched this one on. Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, and I hope you don't think it was too much of a mistake. Before I get started, I'd like to thank John Cately, who's a valued colleague at the Bluebell, for having asked me to do the talk, but I must stress that you mustn't blame him for the content or for the quality of one or two of the pictures. No, well, we'll come to the obituaries later. Now, I also particularly appreciate June Beedham, another good friend from even before she joined London Buses, coming along to give the occasion, dare I say it, a touch of style. Apologies to Barry, by the way, for making him sit through stories he first heard when I spoke at the Omnibus Society's 1989 presidential weekend in, I think it was Boulogne, wasn't it? Boulogne and Ghent. Barry will also know that although I'm wearing an AEC tie, I never worked there. It was left me by the father of an old girlfriend who used to make gearboxes at Southall, the father that is. And I wear it with pride given the association between LT and AEC over a long period of time. Now, my credentials for talking about transport in London are essentially as a Londoner and a consumer. I was born in Guy's Hospital, and I spent the first 6 years of my life in Forest Hill. And we had these at the end of the road, and that's the Horniman Museum. And we had trips through the subway and all the things you could do. We went to the Festival of Britain by tram, and we left just after they finished, but I can vividly remember a nighttime encounter with a works car on the supposedly abandoned stretch of line to Catford, which I know greatly surprised my father and the other people in the car we were in, because the current was supposed to have been turned off, and it definitely hadn't been. Now, weekends we visited my granny in Loughton, of which more shortly, and we'd get stuck behind trolley buses in Leytonstone High Road, where the congestion around 1950 was a great deal worse than it is now. And sometimes we sampled the then very basic East London line, again of which more. Now, at the end of 1952, we moved to Loughton, not far from its spectacular and still newish Central Line station. And from my room, I could hear the tube trains. I could also hear the goods engines shunting at night and the early morning steam trains that still ran to Ongar. J15s and F5s for the steam buffs among you. And this is a scene I got to know well. This is actually Epping. And there are two Central Line trains as they appeared in the LT timetable, each very much with a charm of their own, though I think the steam one had rather more redeeming features. For a treat, my auntie used to take us to Ongar occasionally, and of course you can now go there on the Epping-Ongar Railway, which is a fine counterpart to the Bluebell. Just incidentally, did you know that the priest who went down with the Titanic started his journey from Ongar Station? And there's actually a plaque to him on the platform now, which the preservationists have put up. Credit where credit is due. The lengths people take to get away from some places. Also occasionally, we caught a BR excursion train from Loughton to the south coast, hauled by steam and then briefly by diesel. And the treat was getting into Liverpool Street Station and a whole lot of tiny tank engines appearing and snuffling us through the East London line on the way to somewhere hotter and usually with a slightly faster engine on by the end. Now, it was in Loughton, or rather at my school in Woodford, that I got the bus bug. Just as Loughton Garage's STDs were being replaced by the ubiquitous RT. And here you have an STD on my route to school, the 38A. Now, I wasn't really aware that that's what they were, but I did know when they went, because, of course, the STD had a bump just behind the driver's cab with the word Leyland on it. And when it wasn't there, we knew we got something else. And sadly, we never saw those again. I think there is one surviving STD somewhere in former Yugoslavia, but it doesn't look like it very much, and efforts to repatriate it and turn it back into the real thing I think are now probably beyond the point where you could do it. Now, this is the brand new Loughton Garage. This is a RT on the 20. It was lovely contemporary building, symbolic of post-war Britain. The only thing was it was far too big for the services it was operating. And although much later they tried to run buses across to Waltham Cross and various other places, it could never be filled with buses. In fact, it ended up being used, half of it, by May and Baker as a pharmaceuticals depot. But for quite a long time, if you crept in, you would find 40 country area RTs, brand new, de-licensed with their tyres off at the back, waiting for them to finish Harlow New Town and put on the services that were going to come there. And there was also, and this was the real treat, this. It was the real thing. It was a civil defence Q-class mobile gas unit. And I think there were several of them, and I did once see it moving through Tottenham. But for those of us who had only read about pre-war buses, this was a real treat. You may realise in the 1950s our sights were rather lower than they are now. Now, Loughton Station, RTs queuing up to start their 75-minute journey to Victoria. I remember reading a piece by Gavin Booth, when I think he was about the same age as me, who had tried it and discovered how long it was and found it much, much quicker to make the journey by tube the next time. Now, I'm glad this failed to reproduce, because it conceals the fact that this isn't an RT. It's actually a Clapton RTL, a few of which ran the route for a very short time. So that's my excuse for having done a piece of photoshopping that didn't work. Now, by comparison, that's not much better. This is Loughton Station as it is today, and you would have been able to see my boyhood friends, Andy Wiltshire, Roger Neville, Adrian Fole, and the late and much missed David Roberts, he in the white shirt. But I'll hope possibly that some of the other pictures don't turn out quite like that one. Now, another trip was a Sunday morning visit to Ilford on the 167 to travel on the SA class trolley buses with their tinted windows, and here they are. They were lovely. The one difference, although they couldn't be shipped to South Africa because of the state of the war, and they had to go to Ilford because they're 8 foot wide and the police wouldn't allow them anywhere else. And the one concession they made to operating in London was they'd taken out the whites only notices, which had been put in prior to their being sent to South Africa, thankfully. Now, from my classroom, I could see the Leighton Trainer, which was a pre-war RT going past every day. 400 yards further towards London was the Napier Arms trolleybus terminus. And a short distance further, you could get RTWs on the 41. So there was quite a lot to keep us occupied, particularly as we were allowed out for lunch. While I was at that school also, LT replaced their bell punch tickets with Alloy and Gibson machines. So for ticket fans everywhere, you probably won't be able to see this, but it's meant to be some real nostalgia. There we go. The only one you can see actually is the Sheffield Joint Omnibus Committee, which I'll come back to. These long ones were, of course, most of these had every single fare stage spelt out on them. And for the Green Line, this was, I think, 2 and 7pence. It took up all that, every stage from Epping to Windsor. It really was quite something. Those were also the days of the red and green Rover tickets. And with my cousin, who's a tram nut, I toured the central and the country areas. Our great ambition was to get right round London using country buses. And one time we came pretty close to doing it. We started at Epping, and here are some RTs in Epping Garage. Yes, I'm afraid the same thing again. Until it's another of mine. And we managed by 8 p.m. to get all the way around to Wadden, south of Croydon, which I thought was pretty good going. And then we realised that we weren't actually going to make it, and we came back by train. And here, well, that's marginally better. This is from a Red Rover outing. That's a TD at Mill Hill. You can at least get the idea of the overhang of the roof above the entrance and of the radiator, even if you can't see the bus. Now, that's going to be up there for a while, I'm sorry to say. I switched schools to Highgate in 1959, just before RMs took over from the trolley buses into Highgate Village. And I had 4 ways of getting to school. I get the tube changing at Tottenham Court Road. I could get what's now the Goblin line between Leytonstone High Road and Upper Holloway, 38, 123 and 41 buses via Turnpike Lane, or the 718 Green Line to Finsbury Park, and then the 211. And it was a period of change. We had silver trains taking over from red ones on the Central Line. Then just as I left university, the Victoria Line opened, and that completely transformed the pattern of bus routes in northeast London. A whole lot of interesting services were introduced, and Loughton gained a lot of local ones, which sadly have now gone. Once Essex County Council realised they were having to pay for them. It was the price we paid for not going into Greater London in the mid-60s. Anyway, most of my working life has been spent in London, but there was a lengthy interval in Sheffield, shorter ones in Birmingham and Washington, and also sometimes when I've actually lived outside the capital. In Sheffield from 1968 to 74, I covered the City Council, which of course was also a major transport undertaking. Sadly, it had just replaced its modern trams with Atlanteans, but I must say this livery is magnificent. And I think if you can't have a tram, that's the bus you want. And interesting, one of the new generation of trams has now been turned out in that livery. There were still some oddities up there, but there were some fairly old vehicles, and also you had the services from the west of Sheffield into the Peak District being run by the Sheffield Joint Omnibus Committee, which was a joint venture with British Railways. And one railway story I covered up there was the last train to Manchester through the Woodhead Tunnel. It was so late that we missed the last train back to Sheffield. And after we staged a sit-in in the station master's office at Manchester Piccadilly, a filthy train and even filthier crew were found to take us back. It's just as well that it was provided, because on the way at Dunford Bridge we picked up 2 Kiwi hikers who hadn't realised they'd missed the last train ever. And as this was the first week in January and weather in that part of the world is what it was, they were just about frozen solid when we got them on the train. In better weather, I also captured the moment when BR, doing a huge PR exercise, reunited a boy from Rotherham with the dog his family had lost on the train coming back from Margate, where they'd been on holiday. And photo call was arranged, the train arrived, the door opened, and out came the guard with a dog the boy had never seen before in his life. It was a bit of a fiasco, really. I was still in Sheffield when the South Yorkshire PTE was set up, merging Sheffield, Barnsley, Rotherham and Doncaster municipals and taking in various other odds and sods. They had all the arguments you'd expect about liveries, and they ended up with a brown one. And the smaller boroughs were all determined to give Sheffield a kicking. On the first morning of the new undertaking, everything seemed to be going well, and then we started getting phone calls with people ringing up asking what had happened to their buses, which apparently hadn't turned up. Now, I rang the PTE's Director General, Noel MacDonald, who was always very approachable, and asked him what was gone wrong. He said nothing as far as he knew. And I said, what changes have you made since yesterday? He said, we changed some of the route numbers. I had to explain to him the number change had led to people standing at isolated bus stops in the countryside while their usual bus zoomed past, because they didn't realise it was the one they were meant to be on. Now, even before the PTE was set up, Sheffield and Rotherham had commissioned a land use transportation study, which was a massive exercise in public consultation aimed at planning networks for the future. What it couldn't predict, of course, was the near collapse of the area's staple industries of steel and engineering, which would completely alter travel to work patterns. And also the Meadowhall shopping centre, which completely destroyed one of the finest city centre shopping areas in Europe, and again altered the way people travelled. And so what was intended to serve as steelworks ended up serving a shopping mall. Now, I kept close to the study, and at the start of 1974 I was rewarded by being slipped a copy of its report, which recommended bringing back the trams. Now, I knew the councillors who'd scrapped Sheffield's tram system had come to the conclusion that they'd made a mistake. And so the report was greeted by enthusiasm in the city, though not in outlying areas, who knew they wouldn't get trams but thought they would have to pay for them. I moved away soon after, but I kept an eye on the progress of what eventually became Supertram. Now, decision-making being what it is in this country, it was 20 years after that report before the first tram actually ran. And successive governments blocked efforts to extend the system in modest ways until tram-train came along. It hasn't carried the huge number of passengers its predecessor did, but it's a useful and worthwhile system, and hopefully it's got a future. But that is right in the centre of town. My old office was beneath that clock tower. The newspaper, of course, has now been relegated to an industrial estate the other side of Rotherham, because there was more value in the building than there was in the title. The next few years were a bit of a whirl. Tufnell Park, Birmingham, Lee Green, Washington, D.C., Beckenham, Reading, Ladbroke Grove, Snaresbrook, and then Highgate again. Now, my grandfather had worked in County Hall in the education department. He was actually there when it opened. And while in Sheffield, I applied for a job in the GLC press office. When I got there, I blew the interview because it was quite clear they didn't reckon my experience of local government in a city of 500,000 people counted for anything at all. In Birmingham, I parked my car on the remaining platform of Snow Hill Station, which had just been closed. Of course, in those days, no one imagined it would reopen as a sort of finest wind tunnel outside Farnborough. And in Washington, I commuted in from Friendship Heights, just over the District line, which I hasten to add is not an underground line. It's the boundary between the District of Columbia and the states of Virginia and Maryland. And I was in Maryland. The Metro, frustratingly, opened to Friendship Heights, our local station, weeks after I was called home for a general election that didn't happen. So I always commuted in by bus. In Washington, I picked up two cautionary tales about transport planning and bus operations. The 1976 bicentennial celebrations were imminent, and it was decided that the Metro line serving National Airport had to be open because there was going to be a huge flood of incoming tourists. Of course, infrastructure projects being what they are, it opened 6 months after the bicentennial on stilts on the other side of the airport car park, and so two golden opportunities were lost. Now, very few tourists actually came, which was a bit frustrating for the bus planners who'd actually laid on an extra 17 routes to cater for them. Now, here's a Metro bus, or as you normally heard them referred to on the radio in London, a disabled Metro bus. I had never realised until I went to Washington just how good LT's engineers were at actually getting buses out and making sure that the ones that went out from the garage in the morning got back all right, having done what they were supposed to do. Every morning on the local news in Washington, you get traffic report, disabled Metro bus so-and-so, disabled Metro bus at somewhere else. And despite fragmentation, seeing a paralysed bus in London is still relatively infrequent. And I think that's a tribute to a lot of hard work by a lot of very skilled people. Back to the bicentennial. On the night, the big night, 1 million Washingtonians turned out to watch this stupendous firework display with the promise of plenty of buses home. Now, when the fireworks ended, someone was supposed to ring the depots to alert them and get the buses out, and the call was never made. And there were a lot of very sore feet that night, including mine. Now, for most of the 20 years from 1978, I was working as a lobby correspondent at Westminster, first for the Telegraph and then for a range of mainly Scottish papers. You had to be an expert on everything. We did have specialist transport and environmental and defence correspondents, but if anything happened, you were expected to be able to deal with it. So the odd transport story did come my way as the Thatcher government clashed with Ken Livingstone over fares fare, the National Bus Company was privatised, London's franchise bus system was set up, and as Bob Re-1 started making the railways more commercial. We also covered elections, of course, and that's where I first met June, who was organising the free bus the CPT put on to ferry the political hacks between the party's press conferences. And I have to say, I think we caused you a few headaches, but I think you made a few friends out of it, and we certainly owe you a lot. Now, two vignettes from those years in the lobby. First, a lunch, a couple of other political correspondents and I had with Ken Baker, who I think was then Environment Secretary. And we, off the top really, we asked him if anyone in government was thinking of privatising the tube. Ken thought and suddenly realised that if we ran a story like that, everyone would blame his great rival John Moore. So he said, yes, I think this is something we might very well take a look at, knowing it could never be attributed to him. We did the rest. And under John Major, you may remember that Steve Norris cleared the way for LT to upgrade the East London line, which was something that was long overdue. Just as the work was about to start, Stephen Dorrell at the DCMS listed Brunel's Thames tunnel through which it was which it was passing, making it impossible to carry out the work. And before long, Steve was telling me that he'd had a very interesting phone call with Dorrell, in which once he got the expletives out of the way, he told him he was quite happy for the thing to go ahead in the way that Dorrell was suggesting, as long as DCMS paid for the upgrade instead of LT. I don't know who did in the end, but of course it's been upgraded again since and is now the all-singing, all-dancing 5-car train system with an intensive service that we have today. Perhaps my closest involvement with London's transport came between 1987 and 89, when I was writing leaders for the Telegraph, incidentally sharing a desk with the young Boris Johnson. The most emotive issue during that time, of course, was the King's Cross fire. And I'm sure none of you need reminding of it, but this is the scene in the ticket hall. And if you remember also, that disaster was followed by a series of service failures on the Northern Line and commuter protests which were met with threats of prosecution. It was a very, very unhappy time. Now, in this climate, with the blessing of my editor, Max Hastings, who of course went on to edit the Evening Standard, I sat down and thumped out a no-punches-pulled editorial which began, "Is anybody actually running the London Underground?" Next morning, I got a call from Neil Garry, the Underground's head of media, who became a good friend. He suggested Max and I come in and see Tony Ridley, so we could get a better understanding of the situation. I'm sorry to say the meeting wasn't a success. Max and I recently had a session with the Archbishop of Canterbury, which had left Max with the impression that Runcie had next to no control over the Church of England. And Max left 55 Broadway reckoning that Ridley was in much the same position where the Tube was concerned. However, Neil and I kept in touch, and one day he ran to pick my brain. Dennis Tunnicliffe, Tony Ridley's successor, was thinking of standing as a Labour candidate for Reading Council, and did I think this was a good idea? I told him I thought it would go down like a lead balloon with commuters, who reckoned running the Tube was a full-time job, and thankfully he dropped the idea. Later, of course, he became an effective Labour life peer. This period turned out to be the nadir for the Underground. Tony Ridley's plans, not just to modernise an obsolescent system, but to increase capacity, turned out to be just ahead of the game as passenger numbers bottomed out and began to recover. And before long, I was speculating in print about new routes, of which only the Jubilee line has come to fruition. I also found myself covering the initial teething troubles and subsequent success of the DLR. The Telegraph moved to South Quay before the DLR actually opened, and to begin with, we commuted by boat from Charing Cross Pier, which was quite an experience. On one occasion, the boat rammed a Brazilian warship, which was interesting. Now, to start with, as you may remember, the DLR was a pretty small-scale operation, running across an urban desert. There was literally nothing there at all. We could look across to Canary Wharf and watch the very first piles being sunk. Now, after we carried a leader lamenting its initial unreliability, Max took a furious call from Arnold Weinstock, defending the DLR's groundbreaking GEC technology. That's all very well, Max told him, but I'm sitting here watching the bloody thing and it's been stranded for the last 40 minutes. When the DLR was promoted, of course, it was touch and go whether it was going to be this automated and segregated system or a more modest street tramway. One of London's other great late 20th century successes, of course, has been Tramlink. And I think the failure to extend it to serve the likes of Sutton and Biggin Hill has been a great wasted opportunity, though I see Sutton is back in the frame tonight if money can be found for it. Now, Ken Livingstone proposed unconnected routes elsewhere in London, one of which Julian worked on. Boris wasn't interested in light rail, and then Sadiq Khan was left without any money. Hopefully, though, Tramlink will still go further. I live close to it, but frustratingly, it doesn't go to any of the places I can't more easily get to by bus. But it's always a treat to go on it. Now, from 1987 onwards, first at the Telegraph and then at other papers, I was plugged into the promotion and building of the Channel Tunnel. It's a nice piece of symmetry for me that the Telegraph now occupies the offices over Victoria Station, from which the construction of the tunnel was organised. I was lucky enough to get on the first man-rider trip for the press through it. I still have my certificate saying I was the 241st person to go through the tunnel. For a time, I was also a consultant to London and Continental as it won the contract to operate Eurostar and build High Speed 1. And here is, well, That was supposed to be a better picture than the other ones I took, and in better colour. But that is supposed to be Tom Daley launching South Eastern's javelin service for the Olympics at the seriously misnamed Stratford International. As an aside, I'm also now married to the charming lady who briefed me all those years ago on BR's plans for a Channel Tunnel terminal at King's Cross with low-level platforms for Eurostar and Thameslink. She can't be here tonight because her cousin from South Shields has come to stay, but she sends her good wishes. In the early 1990s, I covered the political scene for the Scottish Daily Record. That gave me the opportunity to sample the transport offerings in cities like Glasgow, in particular. Later, as a special advisor to a Labour Secretary of State, I was involved in trying to get the Airdrie-Bathgate line reopened, as it since has been, and in trying to justify to Alistair Darling heavy rail connections to Edinburgh and Glasgow airports. The business case, particularly for Glasgow, was pretty dubious, and neither has yet happened, though I see Glasgow and Renfrewshire councils have now agreed on a light rail option, and it looks as if it could just happen. They seem to have the money anyway. More recently, I freelanced, as Barry mentioned, for Today's Railways, founded by Peter Fox, who with me organised that sit-down at Manchester Piccadilly in the first weekend of 1970. Peter sadly is no more, but the magazine's going strong. It is still produced from Sheffield, which along with the football gives me an excuse to go up there. As their London correspondent, I've covered in particular TfL's development of London Overground, in which I have a direct interest, living close to Annerley and Crystal Palace stations. Now this should be Crystal Palace getting its roof back. And amazingly it is. I don't quite understand that, but there you are. You can just see the beginnings of the new roof going up. Ian Brown commented that trying to get the money for this was like trying to sell the big issue. But it took TfL several years to raise, I think, the 2.4 million it needed. But it's been money very well spent. And when you consider that this half of the station had 2 trains a day in the mid-1980s, it now has 2 an hour to London Bridge, 2 an hour to Victoria, and 5 an hour to Highbury and Islington. And, well, you can see the people. That just proves, as they said in that film, build it and they will come. We wait to see whether that applies to HS2. Now, I think probably it will. I've got out and about also as London Overground has increased its reach and brought in new rolling stock. And in the process, I've encountered my old colleague Boris on station platforms from Willesden Junction to Enfield Town. And that, he hasn't blacked up for the occasion. That again is, but that is Boris getting off the first London Overground branded train at Enfield Town. You can tell this is the first full presentation using this system I've ever tried. But there has been an element of censorship in the dark months. Now, more recently I've covered the Travails of Crossrail, which I'm told was first proposed in 1906. It's extraordinary to me that Crossrail Limited ever imagined the Elizabeth line could open in December 2018. My youngest son, who was living at Whitechapel, called in when the locals were shown how the station was coming along and told me there was absolutely no way it could be ready in a few months' time. Weeks later, I attended a non-Crossrail meeting in the Chief Executive's suite at Crossrail's Canary Wharf HQ, and I was amazed to find most of the staff had already been terminated. There was just a skeleton team who were in the process of being moved to Stratford. Clearly there was a total belief among the higher echelons of Crossrail that the job was done. One of these days we may know how they came to that conclusion. Anyway, now the important thing is now that the completion of Crossrail is under tight management, and if ever a way can be found for 3 systems to speak to each other, it will open. And I will look forward very much to travelling on it. Now, as was kindly mentioned at the beginning, I also now write obituaries for the Telegraph, mainly of politicians, but when I get the opportunity, I write about colourful figures in transport. Most recently, Ron Cotton, the BR manager who rescued the Settle and Carlisle line. Before that, Chris Moyes, the route master-owning co-founder of Go Ahead, who sadly died young. Harry Blundred, the buccaneering founder of the Oxford Tube. And, of course, Ralph Bennett, the only head of LT not to be knighted after he was shafted by Horace Cutler. And here he is doing to a DMS what a lot of us would like to have done to a DMS. Now, I might just add that my most willing informant in both the Bennett and the Blundred MPs was one Peter Hendy, who, despite the pressure of running Network Rail and all the other calls on his time, came straight back with emails with really useful information and contacts about who to talk to. Once a busman, always a busman. Now, a few years ago, I was visiting your sister museum, Crouch Tramway Village. I'd first been there on a working party in 1963 when it looked like this. And that was exactly what it looked like. No censorship there. The black's the mud. It was really just a quagmire with a few bits of rail and one or two trams with tarpaulins over them. Going back fairly recently, I was browsing in the bookshop and I found a book on Croydon's tramways. And out of it leapt this picture, taken from my own front gate in Croydon Road, Annerley in 1905. That's the Edwardians for you. You can see a tram there. There's another one up there. That is Holy Trinity Church, which is now round the corner, happy clappy, and about a quarter of the size. But I am pleased to say that on this road, there are still 4 bus routes. There's sadly no longer the 12, which would have taken me all the way to Willesden Junction if I'd had the patience. One other thing I do, as Barry also mentioned, is write the occasional book. And a couple of years ago, I had just finished a history of the Dudding Hill line, which some of you may know, the former Midland Railway route, which got coal into Kensington and very heavy coal traffic round to Brent sidings on the southwestern, and also had a passenger service which putted out, I think, months before the death of Queen Victoria. Now, it was done as a history, the great look back, a little bit of stuff about all the efforts that have been made to include it in Heathrow Express and other things more recently, and possibilities with Crossrail and various things, schemes that were blocked by NIMBYs in Richmond, etc., etc. Anyway, 2 things happened just as I was going to send it to the publishers. The first was that Sadiq Khan announced West London Orbital, under which it was to be resurrected with regular London Overground services, not, I suspect, electric, from, let's get this right, Hendon to Kew and West Hampstead to Hounslow, incidentally serving the new Brentford football ground, which is built on the goods yard at Kew. I then discovered that one of the signalmen on the line had written his own book, coffee table book, with some beautiful pictures in. Now, we put our heads together and decided the best thing to do is produce one book, which we're now working on, and I'm just waiting for his chapter on the signalling system back, and then we shall hopefully be able to move on to the next stage. Anyway, that is where we get to. I'll go back past pictures of various degrees of competence to the very beginning. Actually, I'll stop it on my favourite. Thank you for listening to me. It's been a real pleasure. I've talked for longer than I told Barry I was going to, so I hope there's still a little bit of time for questions and discussion.
There will be. Thank you, Nick, very much indeed. Nick's left a goodly time for questions. He's ranged very broadly over all sorts of transport interests, so you can probe him in a bit more detail. I suggest that it may be tempting you don't ask him what he spoke to Boris Johnson about, because we're broadcasting live tonight, so you never know who's listening in 10 Downing Street. Right, who's got a first question, or indeed a comment, something that may have sparked a personal interest? Excellent. Could just wait for the microphone, because it helps those particularly sitting behind you to hear what the question is.
I have to say that your stories about Loughton rang all sorts of bells, because I lived there from 39 to 50, which preceded the STD. In fact, the buses that I was used to were the old LT 3-axle 6-wheelers with the curly staircase at the back. But I remember all those things. I saw them build the new Loughton bus garage. Did you ever see the old Loughton bus garage?
I never got inside it. It was, I remember at the 1955 election, it was empty and had huge Labour election posters over the door. It then became the Co-op Bakery, and then became a DIY shop.
Yes, I think it's Home Base or something like that. Yes, now.
Yeah, no, I was living at the other end, the station and the Crown,
Right.
with its very old
end.
style.
That was the posh end.
Well, yes.
uplands and
Yeah, and then, of course, you had the 254,
Yes.
originally TDs and then RFs, which did the little bit round to Buckhurst Hill and later on to South Woodford. And that was always fun to travel on. And it's been nice going back for a couple of bus running days and going on it. Because I think the RF is possibly a bus which more attention needs to be paid to, even though I do realise that people were smaller and more nimble in the 1950s than they are now. And I wouldn't want to try and get my shopping onto one. But
of course, I knew the 10A route, which later became the 20.
yes, well, a lot of these things I must have seen as a toddler, but I don't remember them directly. I do remember the
Oh, you're
LTs,
so
but not
young.
from Loughton. I can remember them in central London, but I must have been on them.
Yeah.
One particular memory is of Christmas Day in about 1958, and in those days there was a full bus service on Christmas Day, and an RF going through Loughton High Road, absolutely covered in snow. And I think there's only been one white Christmas or two since then. And I wish someone had taken a photo of it. I wish I had, for that matter, because it would make a marvellous Christmas card to send out now.
Yeah. Anyway, great.
Well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed that bit.
Can we go back to the lobby correspondent days, because you touched upon that era with June, who's here tonight, and Neil Gary, who was another colleague of both of us at the time. Do you think that London Transport was effective in the way that it addressed its case to central government, or not?
I think it was probably easier for it to address its case to central government in those days because it was a nationalised industry and there was a recognised framework for doing it. I think you only have to read Terry Gourvish's books about BR to see how BR handled central government. And I think LT was pretty good at it. I think it got a lot of what it wanted. Obviously, it was hamstrung by government spending limits and pay policies and things like that. But I never had any dealings until late on with the bits of LT that talked to government. And my impression is that they were pretty good. I think it's helped because there are an awful lot of people in Parliament who've come out of local government and have more understanding of public transport than people give them credit for. Possibly those connections have become strained since municipalities stopped operating their own buses. And it's interesting, the noise now comes from people who've had connections with the PTEs because they're the ones who understand the politics of transport. And rebuilding that is something that's going on at the moment, and it's fascinating to watch it.
Okay. Anybody else? One in the middle there, and then we'll come June right at the front. Right.
Yeah. Did your time at the lobby overlap with Nicholas Ridley at Transport? And if so, are there any interesting tales?
Well, yes. I mean, I was just about the only journalist he'd talked to. We got on surprisingly well when I took him out to lunch after he was appointed. And I suddenly realised it because he was an almost dead ringer for my father. And all the same mannerisms, and in fact some of the same opinions, despite them being poles apart. And it got to the stage where his head of press, Jean Keynes, would say, I think you ought to speak to a journalist. I said, we'll get Nick in. And I go in. And it was usually him sounding off about the last thing that annoyed him. And it was almost always Lord King who had got the better of him yet again over I think it was British Airways merger with or takeover of British Caledonia. I always got in there and found that King had stuffed him and he wanted someone to talk to about it. He had much less to say about rail. I think he and Bob Reid got on incredibly well and had a very strong relationship. And actually, the lobby group I belonged to did once take Bob Reid out to lunch. And we learnt a lot from him. It was just as sectorisation was getting going. The problem is the industrials correspondents got wind of it and fed back into his office the message that we couldn't be relied on. And so that door closed because it was then seen very much as a branch of trade union reporting rather than having anything to do with politics. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Yeah, the other thing was, at the time when I was all the critical decisions were being taken on the Channel Tunnel. The difficulty was that Ridley was going to have to take these decisions in a quasi-judicial capacity, so he couldn't talk to anybody about them. And that was very frustrating because you knew the final say was going to officially rest with him, though in practice his preferred solution was not the one that was adopted. And the one that was, when he actually got to talk to the French, they made it very clear they weren't interested in bridges and things like that, and drive-through tunnels. They wanted something that had a heavy European construction element, and that could only be what became Eurotunnel.
June.
June. I've been waiting 40 years nearly for this one.
It's not that complex. As your mate Boris has put Grant Shapps into the transport hot seat, do you think that's going to be good or bad for transport?
I think it's going to be good. I have to say I've liked what I've seen of him. He seems to have mastered his brief very quickly. He has avoided making most of the mistakes Chris Grayling made, though some of the decisions Grayling took I think may turn out not to have been mistakes. He knows what the problems are. He's got a number of reports coming along which will help him to fix it unless the department get at him. I think he can also tell the department's record, particularly over rail franchising, has been deplorable. He seems to be ready to stand up to the big bus companies in terms of what happens to buses outside London. And there's a frantic lobbying campaign going on involving First Group, Stagecoach and the rest of them to try and prevent places like Manchester getting a London-style system. And I think the government will stand firm on that one. And also, apropos Boris's idea of reeling back beaching, there are three categories of schemes. So the ones where you have to start building, and there's no prospect of anything happening in the short term because we don't do things that quickly. There are things where you simply start running trains on lines that are already there, and there is some scope for that. And also, there's a lot that's already been done and is just coming to a head. Probably should have happened years ago, but in some cases Network Rail's been slow, in other cases there have been other difficulties. But things like getting Oxford, Bletchley, Bedford open again, things like Portishead are just about to be signed off. And so if Boris is lucky, they may happen in time for the next election. But I must say, everything I've seen about Grant Shapps has impressed me.
I suppose as a corollary to that, how do you feel what initially seems like a large sum of money to be spent on buses, but will undoubtedly end up being spent very thinly over a wide area? Is that going to make any difference to the bus industry and the bus passenger?
Well, I think it is
We're being
fortunate.
tempted into difficult political areas.
Well, Boris is interested in buses. He likes them. And that means an awful lot of things when he was mayor, the people in charge of them couldn't get him to engage with. He was quite good at delegating, but the corollary of delegating is that there's nothing that needs to happen, nothing will happen. I think the acceleration of the move towards electric buses, which looks like where most of the money is going to go, is beneficial. There's also a bit of a spin-off in that Grant Shapps is obviously rather keener on light rail, though I've heard enough London Transport Commissioners saying that light rail is not a replacement for the bus. And I don't know if anyone's looked at Tony Street's big plan for... Sorry, is it Tony Street or Andy Street? Andy Street, yeah. His big plan for the West Midlands involving 8 new metro lines, all given names like the Chamberlain line and things. He's quite a showman, even though I can't remember his name. And that is another way in which you decarbonise, though I must say the cost of digging up every road in Birmingham to put the light rail underneath it probably does have a carbon footprint. But a lot of these things, I think, are just a beginning. It may just be show, but I think, and also it's perfectly true, the amount of money they're planning to put into buses is a great deal less than previous chancellors have taken out. And it's one of a number of ways in which local government has been bled by successive chancellors, so that, you know, it isn't just dementia centres that have closed. Bus routes all over the country, including, for example, the town routes in Loughton have gone because local authorities have judged that they simply can't afford to pay for them.
Is there a view from the back row? Nick. The other Nick, I should say.
I was very pleased to hear your recollections about Sheffield. I also come from Sheffield and had a very strong liking for what they achieved in the period I lived there, and indeed for quite a few years afterwards. With all this focus on buses, do you think there is any merit in going through the history books to see whether such achievements from a municipality are realistic in the future? Or do you think the power, as you mentioned just now, of the big existing operators will snuff out that sort of opportunity?
I think it's a question. You used to have the division between county boroughs and ordinary boroughs. Now you're going to have a division between combined authorities and places where a local authority tries to do things on its own. South Yorkshire's an oddity in that you've got MP, Barnsley MP in charge of a conurbation that half of which wants to be connected to Leeds anyway. And I think the real thing is going to be whether they actually dig their heels in and get enough money to do something useful. And then the question is, to what extent will they want to recreate the PTE? I don't know whether whether the City Council on its own now has the political clout to get the better of the bus operators unless the government gives them a framework in which they can do it. I mean, I find going to any city I haven't visited for a time and using the public transport scary. I think most people do. The only place I've ever dropped into and felt completely able to go anywhere in short notice is Salzburg. And going to Sheffield now, I'm still not quite certain, will my Freedom Pass work on the trams? It does. Are these the best routes? I'm going there slightly more often because I have more meetings at the magazine. I'm there more in the day. And I'm just beginning to get the hang of it. But there's no doubt if you have multi-operator conurbations, it is confusing for the passenger. And it doesn't matter how jazzy the notice on the side of the bus about how often it runs and where it's going. The way in which in London there is a route structure everyone understands, the buses are all the same colour, and you just know you won't suddenly find yourself on an express bus with the first stop Chesterfield or something. Or indeed that the bus is going to terminate at the next stop. I just think you get a greater degree of sureness out of this kind of system, but I have serious reservations as to whether the political structure up there is going to mean that Sheffield's one of the places that benefits most.
Could you say a bit more about the practicalities of leader writing? I imagine this must be written on the spur of the moment. Is a big team of people competing to write the next leader, and is there much wasted effort?
Well, it's after the morning editorial conference. The editor will gather with the leader writer, bracket S. At the Sun, there's just one of them, and it was me for a time. At the Telegraph, there'll be 5 or 6 people who'll usually go in. There is a chief leader writer. There'll be 2 or 3 people who write comment columns and are available, a couple of specialists, and ideas get kicked around, and then they decide what the leader's going to be about, what line should be taken, and how much prominence it should get. Leader conferences are great fun. I remember one when the fatwa against Salman Rushdie had been handed down, and Max saying he'd never imagined as an author he lived to see the day when someone issued a fatwa against W.H. Smith. Occasionally, someone gets... I mean, they are there usually to enlarge on the paper's existing policy, which is why the Sunday Telegraph are against HS2. Correspondingly, each leader on HS2 develops the argument further. It's not interested in a change of tack. And so further reasons why HS2 is a bad thing are produced. And, that cows will die and there'll be a greater extinction of greater mass extinction than at any time since the dinosaurs and the other things that we've been told over recent weeks. It's fun. You can get in little phrases. You want to give the reader a chuckle without necessarily demeaning the subject you're writing about. And at the Sun also, the last leader is a haiku basically. And my favourite was elephants swam the Atlantic, scientists have discovered. Then they died out. Couldn't they get their trunks off? But you can have a bit of fun. In terms, I think the efforts are made to make sure that the person writing the leader does know what they're writing about. In fact, although the big leader on the King's Cross fire after the Fennell report came out was actually written not by me but by Max Hastings. My computer packed up. We were up against the deadline. I was struggling to express myself, and Max did what he did so often with so many of his team. He sat down and thumped out the article they would have written if they'd thought of it. And it was very, very good. You do have to have... It's important that it's got clarity and that it brings the reader in. It's no good simply sounding off about something in terms so arcane that no one can understand them. And even Boris, who... what was the word he used for this creature at the bottom of the sea? It was something I'd never heard before. And, even though his head's stuffed with classical illusions and all the rest of it, when he had to express the paper's position on something, it was very easy to understand what he was trying to say. But I think it's something, I think every person on the comment side of a newspaper overestimates the importance of leaders and overestimates how many people read them. And I had a brief and inglorious time at the Independent on Sunday, which I think was shortened by my pointing this out to the people involved in running the paper. But it is something which most papers attempt to do responsibly, and an awful lot of thought and discussion goes into it before anyone starts writing. Though, as always, I've found the best article you ever write is the one you sit down and write at short notice, having had no time to think about it at all.
I'm aware there are some other questions in the hall, but while we're in this area, can I extend the question to the more gory subject of writing obituaries? Because I guess there must be obituaries, many of them that are already written in the knowledge that someone is approaching the age where death is almost inevitable, but equally well, as we've seen over this weekend, sadly, there are people who come into the frame who you would never have in your sights.
Yes.
How does that sort of pressure suddenly to produce an obituary on someone who isn't in the frame actually work?
Well, you need information, you need accurate information, and you obviously in these days of online news consumption, you want to get it up on the website as quickly as possible. On the other hand, you only want to have one go at it. You want to get it right. You want to make sure that you're pitching it correctly. And it is a pressure. It doesn't happen to me terribly often. And we have an ex-BBC person who I imagine did the Caroline Flack obituary. But there will have been enormous pressure from the digital people at 7 o'clock that morning. Get the thing up online. No, hang on, we want to be able to know what we're saying first. We must have something. No, we want to have the right words. And this will have been played out over 2 or 3 hours, slowing down the job of producing the obituary in the process. But what goes up in the end has to be pitched right. You mentioned stock obituaries. We've actually got nearly 3,200 sitting in the system, of which I've written about 600 or 700 of footballers, politicians, artists, church people, horse race, jockeys, trainers, boxers, lion tamers, imperial, sons of the empire, VCs, whatever, and some of them have been in a long time, and occasionally I find one that's really dreadful. I kill it off and start again. But the other problem is that this time of year tends to be one when there's a very high rate of morbidity, to put it politely. And so you have a week when every day there are 3 or 4. Today we've had Harry Gregg, the goalkeeper, and Pearl Carr of Pearl Carr and Teddy Johnson, plus a leading indie record producer and DJ. Now, I don't think we had him. He was only, I think, 46. But there is enormous pressure. And I've got a Labour MP who died on Christmas Eve, who we haven't yet got into the paper. And everyone else has got the same. And, of course, there is the issue of sensitivity. What do you put in? What do you leave out? With one of the bus industry people, I got caught up in a battle between the two halves of his family. And there's always great pressure from ex-wives to leave out the other ex-wife and this sort of thing. And arguments over whether someone was actually a child or a stepchild who they're trying to sort of push up the batting order a bit. And there's that. You have things in their own lives that were sensitive. The classic one was a Labour MP, very well known, in fact, in another sphere as much as a Labour MP. And he was getting on in years, and I thought I should do his obituary. And I couldn't find out what he did in the war. So I rang Tam Diello, I knew him quite well, and said, Tam, can you quietly find out from Jerry what he did, that wasn't his name, what he did during the war? And he came back and said he was at the RAF in Iraq. Fine. And Tam then went on to say, what you must also say, what you have to stress, is that he and Binky, or whatever his wife named, had the closest marriage in politics. Now, fair enough. On the other hand, I had recently heard that the person in question held a party in Annie's Bar to celebrate his 700th conquest. Now, what do you do? I went and consulted my great tabloid friend, Simon Walters, and said, Simon, what should I do? And he said, why don't you split the difference and call it 350? And I said, well, I think his wife's going to be just as upset. And I included it, but a decision was taken to leave it out. The other one, which was a little bit in the same area, was a fairly elderly and slightly sad Conservative MP who turned out to be having a woman round to his office every week to thrash the living daylights out of him. Now, the secretaries in the next room complained about the noise to the chief whip appropriately. And
Appropriate.
I couldn't see this story remaining under wraps. This was when he was alive. And I rang Bill Deeds, who was then the editor of the Telegraph, and I said, Bill, this is obviously a dilemma. Am I right in thinking that you wouldn't like us to run this story, but that if it appears in the News of the World, you'd like us to give it everything we've got? You see, that's just about right. And when he died, I included a reference to this in the obituary, and it was decided that for reasons of taste, we'd leave it out. So, I mean, you have other things like people telling us a relative has died who insist they've been converted to their particular religion. People who are absolutely adamant in their own account of their own lives that they've done something, which you are quite convinced from the record they can't have done. It's a bit like the business about Tony Blair saying he used to go and watch Jackie Milburn playing for Newcastle, when I think Jackie Milburn retired 2 years before he was born. You know, there are certain things that can't be true, and yet people's memories play tricks, and they insist that they're the case. I'm lucky, and I think with the transport industry, you have a pretty good idea what's plausible and what isn't. And if you say you were general manager of Coventry Corporation Transport Department and you weren't, it's fairly easy to find it out. But you do have to watch everything and you have to check everything. And the delight of doing obituaries of people like Ralph Bennett, they hope you wouldn't have to do them, is to go into the minutiae of the past and the point when he arrives in Plymouth to start work in the Transport Department. I think he actually was born in Plymouth. He joins the Transport Department during the war, just as the sole remaining tram route has been severed by a bomb, which makes its operation almost completely impossible. And it's a learning process. All the time you're finding out things you didn't know, and that for me is one of the attractions.
There was at least one other question some while ago from the body of the audience that we didn't take, I thought. May have been. All right, okay.
Yeah, you mentioned this whole Crossrail thing. I mean, I worked next to Farringdon Station, and like a month after it was due to open, it had no roof. I mean, clearly people with their own two eyes could see it wasn't opening by the date. And you talk about us not understanding how the management didn't know that. Do you think it was also a failure of transport and political journalism, that it wasn't really covered in the media, I think, how far adrift they were?
Well, one of the things you tend to find about elements of the transport press is that they have two modes of coverage. One is to tell you how glorious something is going to be when it opens, and the other is to explain why it hasn't. And there's one particular periodical, which I won't name because I think it would be unfair to criticise it because it does a lot of other good things, which is set up in a way that it's always doing this. I think I don't think anybody at any level quite latched on to what was going wrong at Crossrail to its full extent. And it's one of those things, it's a little bit transport, it's a little bit community, it's a little bit politics. I don't think anyone joined up the dots. Now, sometimes the dots thrust themselves before your eyes and you can see what's there. And I'm a little bit surprised that nobody did. But one of the problems we've got at the moment, and it's going to get worse, is that local newspaper journalism in London is falling apart before our eyes. And there simply aren't the reporters around to do it. This is one of the reasons that after Grenfell, that it turned out the local press had done so little on it, because the local paper in Kensington now has one reporter who's based in Dorset. And so I think possibly the people who you might have expected to have got it were people like Construction News. And I think they probably knew quite a lot more than they printed. I see the CN website pretty well every day, and they're very on the ball about these things. But I suspect there was an awful lot of feeling, they're saying it'll open on time, unless we've got something categoric, we can't rock the boat. And after all, these are people with these fantastic records. The one thing that does surprise me about all infrastructure projects that are late or hit trouble, particularly on the railways, is that usually a couple of the really well-known transport consultancies are being paid a retainer by the people who've commissioned the project to tell them if anything's going wrong. And almost invariably, they collect the money and keep their mouths shut. And I think the part that the consultants who were supposed to be keeping an eye on it for DFT, Transport for London, and Uncle Tom Cobley and all, have a lot to answer for. And it isn't just over Crossrail, it goes back. There was the classic example of the remodelling of Rugby Station one Christmas, when Robin Gisby got up there for Network Rail and discovered that there was track without overhead and overhead without track, and people there were saying the job had been done. And that was supposedly monitored by, I think, all three of the big ticket consultants who were being paid by the Office of Regulation to make sure the job was being done, and it wasn't. And I think, frankly, heads should have rolled over that, and it would have been a warning to these bodies who are supposed to be acting as watchdogs that a job is there to be done.
Okay, we've time for one more, two more possibly, if anybody's got one. Right in the middle. We shall get the mic to you.
Good evening. Thank you very much for your talk. You mentioned a few moments ago about arriving in a town you didn't know, and it was virtually impossible to find out the public transport arrangements. There are a few odd bus routes, I think, in the National Rail timetable. Is there a justification for having a complete national integrated transport timetable so that will incorporate bus routes where railways don't go, and at the same time provide immediate links to public transport in our larger towns that would all come up in the same format with a proper map?
I thought somebody was doing this online. I don't know how far it's got, but several people have said they wanted to do it. It certainly would be a very useful thing. I don't think there's any point in producing a hard copy these days. I mean, the National Rail timetable, as far as I can see, is read by Barry Doe, who complains about mistakes in it. But it's essential to have something like that online, and obviously if it's online, you can have links to anything. And I would have thought it was something that a relatively small expenditure of money by the Department for Transport, or even something with the various, CPT, Rail Delivery Group, people like that chipping in, would be very well worth having. But I'm thinking even more than that. If you won't necessarily have been on a train, you won't be looking necessarily for that kind of link. It's the posture of the transport system towards the incoming person that I think is terribly important. And there are some places you go where there doesn't seem to be one. I quoted Salzburg as the best. Most of the other really good ones I've come across have been on the continent. But I think that's because in this country you expect to be disappointed. And maybe I've just been unlucky in the places I've gone to. And I every so often someone says, oh, if you go to Liverpool or Leeds or wherever it is, they've got this fabulous system. And maybe I'm just someone who is that much more panicky about not knowing how these things operate.
Good question for next time's speaker as well, because I'm sure John Carr will have some views on that subject. Any other questions, or are we done? There is one at the very back, and we'll make this the last one then.
You mentioned about obituaries, and you mentioned the famous Ron Cotton. How on earth did he get away with it?
One of the great things about the history of BR is the series of people who got away with it. Jerry Fines got away with it, Chris Green got away with it, Ron Cotton got away with it. And all of them made changes that were immensely beneficial despite tremendous efforts to stop them. I don't think this is something confined to BR. I think you can find any large organisation that has a large element of inertia built into it or caution built into it. And people like that always stick out. And Jerry Fines sadly paid the price for writing a book saying that he'd done it. But I mean, the story of how Chris Green managed to electrify for King's Lynn without anyone really knowing anything about it, and things of that kind, I say, they give you hope. It's far harder to do something like that now, where absolutely everything is crunched. The Network Rail grip process is basically designed to make sure nothing happens. And you don't want money flying around without proper controls. But in Ron Cotton's case, he was, after all, told, your job is to see if there's anything in it. And there's the classic story, which I mentioned in the obituary, of Bob Reed getting off the train at Kyle, actually with Nick Ridley, and being confronted by this poster saying, buy a ticket on the Settle and Kyle Isle and BR will donate £5 to Live Aid. And, it's so marvellous that public transport has people in it who will do that kind of thing. And some of the stories that came out of the birth of the Oxford Tube were marvellous. And the great Blundred story about Badger Line in its earlier days, where he sacked all the drivers and hired milkmen instead because he knew they'd be friendly to the passengers. You can imagine what it may have been like before. But you do need to have lateral thinking, and it doesn't always work, but it's marvellous that people try it.
Excellent. It's been interesting, actually, just how wide-ranging those questions have been into subjects that we don't normally talk about in this forum, but it reflects the wide-ranging nature of your talk, Nick. And I think probably the mainstay of talks in this auditorium, certainly to the Friends, are from the great and the good transport practitioners who say what they have done, what they plan to do. But there is a broader picture from someone like yourself who's sort of stood outside the actual management of it all, but has been a very informed voyeur and critic. And so thank you for giving us that rather different perspective on subjects that we are greatly interested in. And I would ask you, ladies and gentlemen, to show your appreciation in the room around.
Just to say, Barry, thank you very much.
A pleasure. I shall catch up with the missing part of your talk, which I didn't hear with my coughing fit, where I had to briefly leave the room by reading the script. Safe journey home, everyone.